Shalom, everyone. I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Uncensored News on Israel TV Network, and I'm welcoming in my co-host, Dr. Rick Wadge. The doctors are in the house. Hi, Rick.
It is good to see you, Dr. Dina Dye.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing very good. It is a very wet Texas right now. We have
Nice.
many of our stores underwater, if you can believe it. Places
Oh.
where we didn't have lakes, we have overflowing lakes.
You want to send it our way, please?
We would love to do that. We're thankful for the water right now because in about 2 months, we're going to be whining about not having water. So,
Amen, brother. Well, we have a treat for everyone. We have a special show today with a special guest, Matt Ehret. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, thank you for having me back on, Dina.
Our pleasure. And, Matt is near and dear to my heart because he's a fellow Canadian from Montreal, where my dad was born. So that makes us, mano y mano here. But Matt he has a website called The Canadian Patriot. So you guys need to check it out. He's a historian extraordinaire, I would say, geopolitical analyst, author of numerous books, including The Clash of the Two Americas, right? And The Untold History of Canada, correct?
That's right. Yeah, each one of those is a 4-volume book series. One focuses a bit more on recasting Canadian history. The other one does the same thing to a retreatment of the U.S. from 1774 to the present.
Yeah, I had to rearrange my thinking on Canadian history because I realized I was completely brainwashed. So,
4-volume sets, you don't have a life. All you do is write.
I try to balance. I try to incorporate the writing into my life as I'm jogging, going on a date. But yeah, no, I mean, a lot of people think that Canada is a country, and they don't realize it's a synthetic intelligence operation in many ways. There have been country-like or nationalist moments that have arisen from time to time, rarely, but they have been there, which is great and scrubbed from our history books. But for the most part, it is a British intelligence operation, a PSYOP. It has been used primarily most of the time, unfortunately, to try to undermine the viability of the United States, carry out assassinations of great presidents who are trying to resist this international deep state operation centered in London. And that's unfortunately something that Canadians have to at some point come to terms with before we can become an actual viable sovereign nation state at some point. So.
Yeah, I never realized Benjamin Franklin spent so much time in Quebec, right? Rallying the troops and trying to figure out a way to join Canada and the United States. Like, we didn't learn anything. But anyways, yeah. I digress on that. But you should all read that, especially if you have any interest in Canadian politics. So you can find Matt on Telegram, Rumble, Substack, anywhere else?
Well, I guess my websites are pretty reliable. So I have a CanadianPatriot.org website. Don't worry, it's not just Canadian material. A lot of international reports on there, and RisingTideFoundation.net, also very useful.
And he works closely with his wife, Cynthia, who's prolific in her own right. So you get 2 for 1 if you go to these websites. So, but I was reading one of your recent articles, and you were talking about, and I couldn't agree more, that we are, as humanity, at the crossroads, right? That we are kind of in between 2 paradigms, 2 opposing paradigms. So one being the oligarchical paradigm, going all the way back to, really, I would say, the garden and world empire. And we have the opportunity, really, as human species, to push into the area of the creativity instead of the destruction. And what becomes important is what we create to bring about prosperity, et cetera, and what we leave behind. What is our legacy for the future, our children, et cetera, progeny. And the Bible story is really the same stories in my mind, starting with the garden. Like, I would argue, people get into the whole Satan thing, but in many respects, to me, the entity Satan really represents world empire. And you could argue the tyrant, the leader, the ruler. And so there's this clash between humanity and world empire, really, in the garden. And then we see it go through Israel's story, because the backdrop to Israel's story is world empire, whether it's the Egyptians, the Persians, the Assyrians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians, et cetera. And then all the way to the first century with Yeshua, Jesus, And he is fighting, representing the folks fighting against Rome and the Herodian dynasty and really the temple leadership. So the idea here is how does humanity raise their beast nature? And I think the Bible, the main message of the Bible is how does one regenerate the nature of the beast, and how does one resist those powers? And I've always thought, in the way tyrants control is the way, I think Paul is comparing sin to tyrants, that sin controls you in the same way that tyrants control you. It acts in that way. So, to kind of summarize, the Bible is really the story of how Israel resisted her failures and successes. And that here we are in this unique moment in history. How do we resist, the
Yeah.
oligarchical order? The end, I would say, is not a foregone conclusion. It's not inevitable. And I read somebody said recently, a failing nation requires an activated people. So we want to talk about how to be an activated people, because I think by and large that creative element of humans is their resourcefulness is what will help us against the empire, and that we are capable of creating new systems out of the old. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of talking about the tools of the trade, going back to the ancients, like how do they operate? What are their tools to gain power and control, in your opinion?
That's such a good question. Yeah, and I really liked your composition there, the way you framed it. It reminded me, I guess there's two quotes. One, I don't know who did it, but it's something close to my heart, which is that the people get usually the government that they deserve. So you can't always look for others to blame for the problems that you're suffering from when you're dealing with politics, because oftentimes what you've got is not, it didn't arise overnight. It arose over an extended period of time that we tolerated stupidity and corruption because we had a little element of that awoke within our own hearts that allowed us to turn our minds off, our hearts off, and permit for evil to grow and grow like a pox. And the other thing that plays into the Shakespearean quote from Julius Caesar, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings, as I think it's Cassius who said that to Brutus, or Brutus who said that to Cassius. That's it. And so, yeah, I think starting from the standpoint that that the empire's corruption is possible because we have been bestialized, and there have been certain arts of power which have been carried forth for centuries, if not millennia. I would say millennia, that are used and capitalized upon by the enemy. And I'm not talking about necessarily, I'm not referring to a like magical art, but I'm saying that there is a sort of knowledge of the human condition, which the inner echelons of the oligarchy, and there is an oligarchy, there is an encrusted hereditary elite which is managed to maintain institutions over many generations. Let's just say it that way, which does go back in a direct continuity to the leading families of the Roman Empire that tried to smother Christianity in its cradle, and they failed. Right, the more Christians they threw in with the lions or lit into Roman torches, the more that they found people were recruited to this new way, this new paradigm, which people in the Roman citizens who had been debauched, they'd been living under a very degenerate lifestyle, living in a relative amount of abundance in the city center, in the capital, with breads and circus and free flowing wine. They didn't.
Right.
It corrupted them so that they didn't ask questions. Where is all of this affluence coming from?
Mm.
And they didn't bother to look at the fact that Rome had to enslave and subdue and destroy greater and greater rates and amounts of people and victims in the outskirts as it expanded and expanded. And so when
Isn't that one of the problems with empire is it has to always expand, right?
it
It's
has to
continually in that's its MO. And if it doesn't expand,
yeah,
then it destroys.
So
It's
that
like
it has ultimate control. Is that what you're intimating?
yeah, it's wired like the Borg in Star Trek. It can
Right.
only assimilate and or destroy any who resist, but it can't really act like a human being when faced with otherness, when faced with another human being or another power structure that might not want to assimilate into the beast. They can't just accept that or live in neighborly respect. They don't. Those are human things to do. Empires don't. They've let go of their humanity a long time ago,
Yeah.
and they can only destroy, crush, and reabsorb it. So, as far as the Roman populace was concerned, they were finding themselves watching this scenes of debauchery with people who had no great fear. They were living in dignity despite the fact that they were being persecuted, and it was shaming the masses of the Roman citizenry. And so Christianity's power was, I think, partially in the fact that, well, there are many core reasons, but partially it was just that it was a more natural human way of loving your neighbor, living with knowledge that you're made in God's image, that you are more than the flesh, that you are the soul, you're more than that. And it taps us into a source of happiness and a source of power and strength that even you saw this with the children's march in Selma, Alabama, where there was this approach of nonviolence under Martin Luther King's civil rights movement that later on got corrupted or infiltrated by the FBI over his dead body. But you saw the effects of like, Bill Connor and others, like just shooting high powered water hoses at little children who were like being like tossed down the street by these police officers. And you had people across the nation, many of whom were racist, watching this scene thinking, is that what I'm representing? Is this like launching water cannons onto kids? Is that really what I'm doing? I didn't know. And so, it awoke that healthy shame that should be there, because when you act shamefully, we have the feeling of shame for a reason, so that we can repent and correct and self-examine. Then you got the bad shame that the oligarchy likes using for our kids, like in school, where they shame them into being a human because we're pollution machines that destroy nature, and that's what kids are being given in schools as a way of controlling. That's the bad shame. There's no reason to feel bad for being a human, or you shouldn't have to eat bugs to repent, or buy carbon credits or carbon swaps to repent as a new indulgence, right? So that's the bad kind. But there's a good kind. So I think that. The oligarchy knows certain arts of corruption, certain qualities of how to control individuals and the zeitgeist. They explored this in things like MK Ultra, right? How do you use certain techniques to deconstruct and then reconstruct a human personality? This is the CIA MK Ultra program, launched in the early 50s. The idea was, how do you depattern a human being using, some mixtures of shock therapy, psychedelic psilocybines, other forms of drugs that were available also in the oligarchical priesthoods of Rome, of the Eleusinian mysteries of Athens, of the cult of Delphi.
Yeah.
That was part of the indoctrination process for the elite, as well as for the masses, who were turned into a frenzy of bestialized fools back in the cult, in the rituals of Dionysus and Apollo, back in the days of the ancient period. It's known that LSD came from like certain wheat blights that were extracted and used in those mystery religions that were satanic. And they've just found ways in the last 80 years to retool that, maybe with a bit more pharmaceutical power, with mushrooms and again, the same wheat blight LSD derivative or, properties that are then used to try to socially engineer a new gullible population that's more into escapism or living for their hedonistic senses in the now, rather than thinking about, well, what is the cause of the wealth I had experienced under globalization? Where did my cheap stuff come from? Where's this material in my computer or telephone come from? And they don't think about the massive dependency that we have put ourselves on since JFK was murdered, onto cheap labor across the world in sweatshops, extracting wealth from mining operations in Africa, where 40,000 children under the age of 15 work and labor for 14 hours a day in cobalt mines for our cell phones here in the West. We should have done something to stop this new form of slavery from becoming such a beast, but here it is. And so I think in a certain sense, we're kind of paying the same price that the ancient Romans were paying, and the solution is sort of the same.
And Matt and
go
Dina,
ahead, Eric.
yeah, just real quick, what we're talking about is we're breaking down into specific forms, verbiage and things that have taken place over the centuries, but it's the same theme that's taken place at the very beginning of creation of mankind. And that is, number one, who will you listen to? Who will you serve? And this snowballs into, when we're not serving God, into, well, what does that become then if it's either man or who's influencing man, this dark sense of things. And so here we are. And so you have all these intricacies of how we're going to control people so that they're following after something or someone other than the creator. And it's interesting how all these histories are all saying the same thing over and over and over again. And that is just, this is why you need to follow me, us, them, because we're going to provide all your needs, which apparently you're not getting met by the creator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so interesting with the Oracle of Delphi, because I didn't realize it went back to 1400 BCE, which is kind of around the time of the Exodus from Egypt. And, you know, it begs the question, I'm sure they knew about it. So we have this contrast going on between the oracle on top of the mountain there in Corinth, the Corinthian Isthmus, and then we have Mount Sinai, and then God is handing down to Israel, you know, the commandments, the Torah, but really instruction, guideline, guardrails to keep the nation, the society in order. I see these two things kind of converging. And then, of course, you know, with the Delphi Oracle, I got these, Pythias going off half-baked into gibberish. But it was a tool, it was a psyop tool, because they would be able to manipulate, you know, the folks with the money would come in, you know, front and center with their gold and get their response. And then they could just manipulate whether, do we go to war, you know, do we expand militarily over here? And so that was I don't think people realize what a significant and powerful tool that was in the ancient world for so many, you know, we're talking like almost 2,000 years of the Delphi Oracle. And that I think had a stronger influence in the biblical narrative than we know. And then, you know, Paul speaking against it as well. Do you remember the story with the slave girl that comes in and she's making all this noise, and she was probably part of the oracle, I'm going to guess. And then it was all these gases coming up from the crevasse, you know, and you know, drugs being used to seduce and decimate a population. So that's clearly one of the tools of the empire. And I see, you know, corruption, obviously, bureaucracy, incompetence, slavery, centralization. These seem to me to be what the pattern we see over and over again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I like your hypothesis. I mean, certain scholars should take your hypothesis and run with it and see if they can dig up any more material on that. But I think that, yeah, it's something that if you read, I mentioned MK Ultra. If you look at Alan Dulles, who JFK fired as director of the CIA, he had spoken in quite some depth of eloquence about his understanding of the importance of ancient Greek intelligence operations, and specifically the cult of Delphi, in creating myths and creating structures of thought control that would then be able to gather intelligence, deploy people that didn't even know how they were being deployed to serve an end they didn't even understand. Alan Dulles was brought in to these higher level operations, as was the very Albert Hoffman, the very scientist who discovered LSD-25 while working for MK Ultra. He is the world's authority on the Eleusinian mysteries. He published about this in the 1960s, 60s, and 70s. This is what generated people like Timothy Leary and the other gurus of the New Age and counterculture. Yep.
Ram Dass, do you remember him?
Timothy? Yeah, he was closely a part of this. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was part of his whole thing here in New Mexico.
Oh, no, really?
Yes. And when they unveiled the monkey god Hanuman here in New Mexico,
that's it?
I was there.
Oh, no. Oh, wow.
So we'll have to share war stories afterwards. So
yeah,
that's aware of those guys. And part of that
crazy.
whole, you know, hippie thing.
I did not expect that. Yeah, the whole like reviving of Maitreya is coming back. Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. I didn't know that. Yeah, all of these guys were created as part of this whole new approach to creating a new array of synthetic religions, some big, some small. You know, you had the the Hare Krishna variants. You had a whole bunch. You had the Jim Jones also emerged out of this whole MK Ultra CIA led project as part of a multifaceted. There were multiple Jim Jones operations or villages. It wasn't just one. And it was always directed by the CIA. The same thing for Charlie Manson. The same thing for a lot of these cults, the Moonies. Some Young Moon got his brainwashing when the U.S. military was occupying Korea, and he was part of a guinea pig operation. And he even spoke about his brainwashing later on, thinking that that's where he discovered that he was the brother of Christ or something. It's weird.
Well, so it appears from what you're saying, really the number one tool then of world empire is surveillance and intelligence.
It's surveillance, and it's epistemological warfare. For those who might be intimidated by the word, epistemology is simply the study of knowledge, structures of knowledge. And so, if you every ideology, an ideology simply is a set of logical consequences to certain ideas. Now, not all ideologies are necessarily bad, because certain ideas are true. Right? We are made in the image of God. If you start from that as an idea, as a concept, a bunch of logical steps will naturally flow from that seed, which will tend to be quite good. What type of government should we have that supports my concept that we're made in the image of God and thus have a soul and thus are sacred as life, right? Well, a whole bunch of very positive concepts will logically follow. If you believe mankind is made in the image of mud, or we're just another type of monkey pleasure seeking, pain avoiding machine. If that's your concept, well, it's a wrong concept, but a whole bunch of consequences are going to flow in your ideology. So I think when you look at how ideologies are created, deployed, and manufactured to shape the behavior of and the worldview, the lens through which we choose to look at the entire world, our future, our past, our identities, there's certain controlled lenses that are shaped by certain concepts that are false, and the oligarchy can weave these false concepts and justify them according to certain standards of what Jeremy Bentham, who ran British intelligence during the American Revolution or a little bit afterwards, called the hedonistic calculus. Concepts of good and evil that are rooted in standards of pleasure and pain. Everything that gives me hedonistic pleasure is the basis upon which I judge that which is good, and everything that gives me pain physically are things that I judge are that which is bad morally. And it's like, well, there's a lot of problems, because if you look at how human beings actually are, we make sacrifices of our pleasure to protect our children or give our children a better life. This is very satanic. I think this is part of the core method of Satanists. Even those who don't even know that they're Satanists will always try to reduce us to that type of hedonistic machine, and obscure our more divine part of ourselves that we could cultivate, shape, and animate as we become a mature identity and do things in the real world. So it's this epistemological warfare, and it helps to have people on drugs. Yes.
So, and works every time.
Like that little post added thing there. That's great. It does help to have people on drugs, and we're seeing that. Well, or at least I think we probably all would agree, this is probably one of the motivations for governments to legalize drugs in different states in the U.S. for sure. Because if everybody's happy, fat and happy, then they're not going to argue with what's going on. Just take care of me, I'm good.
Yeah.
I just read with the ATF or whatever, they're saying that if and this applies to every state. So if you're smoking marijuana or you're on marijuana, you're not allowed to own a firearm. So I'm like, that looks like a plan, right?
Oh, yes.
And that's a federal thing. It doesn't matter what your state says about marijuana, because it's legal here and it's legal in Canada, but you're not allowed to own a firearm. So, of course, that's one of the tools, right, to de-arm us, which is one of the greatest things about the Constitution. Really, of all the Bill of Rights, I feel the right to bear arms is probably numero uno to protect all the other rights in the Bill of Rights. So that's interesting. So one of the tactics
you're talking to a Canadian right now. We haven't been able to look at a firearm in a while, and drugs are legal, not just weed. But if you go to British Columbia, you can get high quality methamphetamines, cocaine, heroin, whatever you want. It's all legal. have fun, and
Well,
yeah.
we can show you our array of firearms if you come on down and visit us, and we can
Well,
see.
you're talking to a Texan here, and so what do you do
I have a gun range on my property.
when you
Whoa.
can't take away the guns from the Texans? What do? You open up the border and flood it so that it looks like, okay, there's so much violence. We definitely have to take away the guns.
Yeah, there's a lot of these techniques. It's a dirty game, and
Yeah.
I mean, the they definitely don't play by. That's another thing, right? With epistemological warfare, is you can create a bunch of rules with the intention that you're like the, what do you call it, the dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons. The oligarchy thinks of themselves as the dungeon master. They make the rules. They set the stage. They don't follow the rules that they make. They make them to be broken by them, which is why, like, for example, the British Empire created the rules of free trade, global free trade, back in the 18th, 19th century. Adam Smith, we're told, was a great American hero, that all good Americans have to abide by free trade of Adam Smith. Who the hell was Adam Smith? He was an employee for the British East India Company. The British themselves, they wanted to have the monopoly of manufacturing that they destroyed from India, that they destroyed in China, that they never permitted in the American colonies. So how did they get their manufacturing? They used protectionism. They didn't do the thing that they expected everyone else to do, which was lay down. Adam Smith has taught us, if you want to be a good world citizen and love freedom, well, you have to open up your markets to the global markets. You have to get rid of national banking, get rid of protectionism, don't infringe on the marketplace, because what's the marketplace? It's the expression of all of our hedonistic desires to buy low, sell dear, avoid pleasure, avoid pain, get pleasure. That's what it is, and that's the source that we were told is of what value pricing should be, and the effect of that was total devastation, speculation, destruction, economic warfare throughout the 19th century. Opium trade pumped down the throats to destroy the souls of the Chinese. A complete devastation in India. 270 million Indians probably murdered by controlled famines under British free trade. And so yeah.
Did Rome do the same thing?
No, it wasn't that sophisticated. These are more modern post-Renaissance techniques of warfare, but similar in the sense of usury. Similar, I mean, there was economic warfare for sure. And if you had the money bags, you could loan out at usury and get people to become dependent on you because they couldn't pay their interest, and thus become more susceptible to doing what you wanted them to do by threat or whatever. Or you could withhold money that they desperately needed, which is what the U.S. has been doing under sanction regime, is not permitting nations to access the money and capital they need to build or to support their people. So yeah, there were techniques of economic warfare.
Okay. Well, our time is going by extremely fast, and we need to take a little commercial break here, and we'll be right back in just a sec.